we speak about the people who are responsible for the exact and precise transmission from generation to generation. Moshe received the Torah being the responsible recipient, as the Torah tells us, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Who is the one who commanded us in the Torah, which is Moshe, Marosha Kilas Yaakov, which is the heritage of the congregation of Jacob. It's Moshe. So Moshe communicated and taught the Torah to the Jewish people exactly as it was transmitted to him to give over to the Jewish people. Moshe Rabbeinu chose Yoshua, who is his main disciple, that he should carry on that responsibility. Only to him, not to anyone else. So the question is, Elazar, who was his father's successor? Elazar was the son of Aaron. He was one of the two surviving sons of Aaron, and he was the elder of the two, and he was of the greater of the two. Why did he give it to Elazar? That responsibility. And what about Pinchas? Pinchas was the great zealot who assumed the position of Kohen, although he was never anointed, because he avenged God's vengeance, and God elevated him to that special level because he atoned for the Jewish people. Why did Moshe choose Yoshua and not the others? What about the Shivim Zekanim, the 70 elders, who God chose that Moshe should pass his spirit on to them, that they should assist him in leading the Jewish people? Why did he pick and choose specifically Yoshua to be the transmitter and be responsible for the exact transmission as it was given over to him? So Rashi says, and this has to do with this week's reading in Chukas, he only wanted to give it over to the one who was literally sacrificed his life. He compromised every physical amenity for the sake of living in the tent of Chochmah, the tent of Torah, the Kodeshem B'Olam. And he had a renown, which was one of a renown because of that. So because he had this characteristic that he sacrificed, as it says, Torah can only be acquired for a person who's willing to die for Torah, meaning you compromise and forgo every comfort in life for the sake of Torah. That was Yeshua, par excellence. Therefore, he qualified the most to be the transmitter of the Torah exactly as Moshe received it at Sinai. We find at the beginning of the book of Dvarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu, it's the last 36 days of his life, and he's recounting the 40 years since they left Egypt. And he's admonishing them, rebuking them for the past. And because he's about to pass away, he's instructing them they shouldn't make the mistake again. The mistakes of the past should be learned, not to repeat those mistakes. And one of the things he says was, Moshe's father was Yisro. And when Yisro was a statesman, and he saw how Moshe was adjudicating single-handedly the whole Jewish people. And he says, you're not doing the right thing, because otherwise you're going to wither. It's beyond your capacity. We have to create a judicial system. Various echelons of judges. The more difficult case, the more qualified judge. The less difficult case, the less qualified judge. And what's most difficult, that they'll bring to you. That was his advice. So he goes, and he presents the new plan to the Jewish people. They're excited, ecstatic. And they say, why should we bother the great rabbi? We'll go to the lesser judge. We'd have to go, everything doesn't have to come before you. So Moshe says to them, but you realize who's now going to be the one who's the interaction between the people and the court? It's no longer Moshe. So Moshe Rabbeinu, when he interacted, he represented the Torah at a one-of-a-kind level. The others They're only recipients of Torah they received from him. So what would you say? So Moshe says to them, why are you so excited? Who's it better to study Torah from, me or my student? So what's the first sense? Why is it better to learn from Moshe, not from the student? Because Moshe learned it directly from the source. God was Moshe's teacher. So if you have it straight from the source, which is the ultimate, and you have it from an intermediary, which is immortal, which is more credible? Which is more profound? You'd say definitely Moshe. He studied it, received it directly from Hashem, from God. But that's not what Moshe Rabbeinu said. Is it better to study it from me and receive it from me? Nation, it's ta'arti oleo. Because I sacrificed. I suffered for the sake of Torah. Why? Because the Torah tells us when Moshe Rabbeinu studied Torah in heaven, he said, Lechem lo achalti mayim lo shasisi. For 40 days and 40 nights, I didn't eat bread, I didn't drink water. Meaning my physicality was compromised for the sake of Torah. It was a miracle he lived, but factually it had its negative effect on him. And he suffered. He says, because I suffered for the sake of the acquisition of Torah. Who is a greater teacher? Me, who nobody suffered as I suffered, or my student, who did not suffer to the same degree? So what qualifies you to be that source of that Torah? The one who suffered more. Not because he learned from God, directly from Hashem. So his source is more credible. No. That have a greater capacity to come upon the risings of truth is because I suffered for it. I sacrificed for it. And nobody sacrificed like Moshe. We're saying, why was Yeshua more qualified than Elazar, than Pinchas, or the 70 elders? Because nobody sacrificed the Torah the way Yeshua sacrificed. It's saying this is the characteristic. This is the quality he has. And if you have that quality, that there's nothing which you're not going to give away for the sake of Torah, that person is the ultimate conduit and repository and source of truth going forward. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu chose Yeshua, because he was Meimis. He was willing to give up his life for the sake of Torah, which nobody was the equivalent of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Yeshua. That's what we say. If you have a mirror, and the mirror has dust on it and some kind of coating, you look in the mirror, it's not going to reflect your reflection. Why? Because there's something which is covering the mirror. What about if you polish that mirror, and now you look in the mirror, now you see a reflection. It reflects who you are. And I mentioned this yesterday. The Gemara tells us in a certain location that Pnei Moshe Pnei Chama. The face of Moshe was the equivalent of the sun. Pnei Yeshua Pnei Levana. And the face of Yeshua was the equivalent of the moon. Every nuance of Yeshua was a reflection of his Rebbe, of his teacher. Anybody who studied was not that reflection. I'll give you an example. A person, you're walking, you have a shadow. The shadow is definitely being cast by the person. But if you wouldn't see who the person is, could you identify the shadow, whose shadow that is? It's not defined. It looks like a human being, but more than that, not. Yeshua, because of who he was that polished mirror. Because of his spiritual capacity, he reflected every nuance of Moshe Rabbeinu. He was a reflection. He was like the moon reflects the light of the sun. Identically, Yeshua, more than anybody, reflected all the qualities and all the knowledge that Moshe had. It wasn't his Rebbe. Yeshua, Joshua was not Moshe, but he was a reflection of him. And nobody reflected Moshe the way he did. But why did he have the capacity to reflect it? Because he was that polished mirror to the ultimate level that he was able, it was polished to such a level of perfection, it reflected every nuance of what Moshe Rabbeinu was. As a result of that, he was most qualified to transmit the Torah in its most precise state, exactly as Moshe Rabbeinu had received it at Sinai. The level of understanding, the depth of understanding, he did not have. Because Moshe Rabbeinu sacrificed to a greater degree, didn't eat for 40 days and 40 nights. That was the context that he received the Torah. as much as a person goes and he sacrificed, it's not at that level. So, but in terms of its entirety, whatever you're able to absorb and receive, he was most qualified than anyone else. Because he was polished, and his polishing gave him the capacity to reflect every nuance who Moshe was, but it's still not Moshe. If Moshe is the equivalent of the sun, and Yeshua is the equivalent of the moon, reflecting the light of the sun. Had the quality, the characteristic of Memis Atzmo. He was willing to die, meaning to forego all comforts of life for the sake of Torah. He has the greatest capacity to be able to absorb and have sensitivities to be a carbon copy of the source. And he was. And that's why he reflected what Moshe Rabbeinu had taught him more than anyone else. Shimon ben Yochai, who's the author of the Zohar, and he was a student of Rabbi Akiva, Shimon ben Yochai, and the Gemara tells of a story, and this was after the destruction of the Second Temple, and he was talking to a number of colleagues, and they began discussing the Roman government, the Roman authorities. And one of them said, despite destroying the temple, they provide for us many services that we're able to live. He spoke favorably about them. Shimon Yochai spoke very critically of them because they didn't value the life of a Jew as much as a flea. And they oppressed the Jews not to be believed. And they issued decrees to literally to put us through the grinder, literally. Okay? Somehow this discussion got back to the Roman government. So the one who praised the Roman government that issued a law that in any public gathering, it was Rabbi Yehuda, he should be the spokesman. He's the government chosen Jew who's a spokesman in any public assembly. He's the one who has to speak first. The one who remained silent when he heard the criticism of Reb Shimon Yochai, he should be exiled. If you hear somebody speaking critically of the Roman government, how do you remain silent? You're not going to be put to death, but exiled you be. Reb Shimon Yochai, he will be put to death because where does he have the audacity to speak against the Roman government? Reb Shimon Yochai fled. He fled with his son, and nobody knew where they were. Where did they flee to? They fled to Meron, which is up north in Israel, and they went into a cave. There was a cave there. And he studied Torah with his son for 12 years. And because they only had one suit of clothing, if they would wear it day in and day out, eventually the cloth would deteriorate. So what did they do? They would unclothe themselves, and they dug a hole in the ground, and they covered their bodies with sand. So their nakedness was covered, so they should be able to study Torah. And in this state, they would study Torah. And when it come time to daven, they would come out of this buried state, put on their clothing and daven. When they finished davening, they went back into the ground. After 12 years, they were so spiritually attuned that literally whatever they looked at, they were able to burn up with their eyes. If it wasn't in conformance to the way they felt it should be, it's spiritually sound, they would give it, they would like zap it. It would be consumed by fire. And they come out of the cave after 12 years, and they see a mundane world and people investing lives in something which has no value. So what do they do? Whatever they looked at, they just burnt up. A heavenly voice comes out of heaven and says, look, I didn't ask you to come out of the grave, out of the cave to destroy my world. You know something? You better go back. Go back. You need a little balance. You're too extreme. Because they couldn't deal with the world being an integration of spiritual and physical material. They went back after the 13th year they came out. Reb Shimon Yochai, because he was actually buried in the sand all the years studying Torah, he suffered tremendously. He had fissures in his skin, like sores, open wounds, and he suffered tremendously from it. And studying in that state, he studied in a tremendous, very difficult state. And he returns and he meets his father-in-law. His father was Pinchas ben Yoyer, was the famous holy rabbi. Pinchas ben Yoyer sees how he has these fissures on his flesh, open up gaps, and he sees how much his son-in-law suffered, and his nephew and his grandson suffered all these years, and he shed a tear. When he shed the tear, tears have salty. It fell into the wound, the gap where Reb Shimon had the wound, and he flinched. So he says to his son-in-law, he says, "I'm sorry for causing you this pain. It's sorry that I'd see you in such a state, that your flesh is all welted and scarred and lacerated." He says, "Woe to me, I see you in this state." He says, "Woe to me if you didn't see me in this state. Because I learned Torah in this state and I suffered. Despite the suffering, I studied Torah. I was able to achieve levels of understanding of Torah, which I could have never achieved those." That's when he wrote the Zohar, the hidden meaning of the Torah. God had revealed to him new understandings of things people didn't understand. So what was Reb Shimon Yochai? He was an example of mitzvah. For the sake of Torah, he was willing to give it all up. Because he wanted to retain his garments to be able to daven in a respectful state. He went and buried himself in the ground. Not that it was very comfortable, very great, even painful eventually, for the sake of Torah. In that state, you merit the ultimate. That's why Moshe chose Yeshua, because Moshe understood why was he able to advance to such levels? Because he was not engaged in the material for all those months, for a month and a half. 40 days and 40 nights I did not eat bread, I did not drink water. And because I sacrificed and I was paying for the sake of Torah, that's why I had a greater capacity. And therefore, nobody had a capacity like Yeshua, because nobody suffered for the sake of Torah as Yeshua. Therefore, he is the most qualified to be the recipient and to be the successor of Moshe Rabbeinu for that reason. To assume the mantle of leadership.